Today we're going to talk about making a paper cut map. This one is going to be of Kauai, one of the islands in Hawaii. I've chosen to make this one in A5 format, which is just slightly larger than a postcard, because it's meant to be framed and sent off. I've chosen some maps here. It's important to remember that maps, much like books, are copyrighted, and so if you're going to use them for any commercial purposes and sometimes even personal uses, that is forbidden. However, if you find U.S. Geological Survey maps, particularly historic ones, they tend to be copyright free and in the public domain. So just be careful what you're using and how you go about using it. So I printed off a couple of things that were in the public domain that I found around the internet for today. So again, this is what we're going to make. This is what it looks like. And I'm going to show you how we go about getting there. So the first things that you are going to need are some supplies. You're going to need the maps that you found. I found a couple of various ones to use so that none of them are particularly too much the same. They give me different elevations, so I have a vague idea of where the mountains and where the plains are, because that particular contouring is very important when you're drawing out your map. Now you're also going to need a few paper cutting supplies. This stuff is all very easily accessible and very inexpensive. Some of it you will already have in your home. So the best way for you to find the maps that you need is to go to Google Images and to search for Topographic Map. Topographic Map, and then whichever actual destination you're using, Kauai in this case. So then it pulls that up for you and you can look through what you've got, what you need. This map is particularly good because the contour is very high, the contrast is very high. You can see exactly what you need to help guide your drawing. This one is also helpful. Again, the contrast exceptionally high. You have a very clear idea of what the different heights of the land masses look like so you can draw your layers. Another good example is this one, which I've also selected, which sort of allows you to see from a different angle, much like this one, which is the other one that I had, where you can actually see from the side a bit more what those layers will look like. So perhaps if you have trouble visualizing what you're looking for, this will be helpful to you. So go ahead and save a couple of those, print them out, make sure that they are roughly the same size when you print them out so that all of your drawings will have the continuity that you need, and take them back to your workspace. You'll need some tracing paper if you're going to trace. You will need a ruler, a knife, this is just my particular kind. You'll need pens, pencil, and something to draw with, essentially. Then, of course, what you need is paper. I find it helpful to choose your color scheme in advance, so it's very easy when you're in the store to decide this will be your bottom, then this layer, no, maybe this layer will work better than this one. You want to get them progressively lighter up to perhaps a different color like brown to signify the top of mountains. You want to make sure that the sort of hues and colors match. You can use whatever you want. The green is sort of okay, it doesn't really fit, but it was the best of my options at the time. So I've already cut these down to the shape 4, but you can see the sort of gradient that I'm working with here. And that's where you want to start. Additionally, you're going to need some glue. This one is Uhu. And this one is repositionable mount from 3M. Both of them are important because they won't warp your paper. You want to make sure that what you're using is not something like Elmer's glue or white paste, because that will cause sort of rippling under the surface, particularly in card. So make sure that what you've got is specifically art glue. The 3M is very worthwhile if you have further projects, as it sprays a very thin, very nice layer of adhesive, and you can reposition it to an extent. But it's probably about $20 or less a can depending on where you've gotten it, but it does last quite a long time. Now that we've got our materials together, let's move on to the drawing. There are a few options available to you when you're going to draw it out. You should think about this in advance. If you are afraid, you haven't done this before, if you need a little bit of practice, watch this section of the video before you do it, because I'll go through a couple of different ways that you can actually draw out and then cut out your map. I will go through 3 different ways to draw and cut out your map. The first is a direct draw method where you draw on scrap and then you cut through that and the layer below it. The second is a cut and trace method where you draw on scrap, you cut through that scrap, then you use that as a tracing, and then you cut through each layer individually. Or finally, using tracing paper, you can draw out your map and then trace that, and then directly trace that back onto each layer. So please watch all of the videos first and decide which way will work best for you based on materials and experience that you have. First, we'll start with the direct draw method, where you draw on the scrap paper directly and then cut through that and each individual layer as you go. So when you're drawing the layers around, now I've drawn some of this out in pencil already here, so you can see I traced the edge of this. You have to remember that your first layer needs to be the outer edge of your map. So I'm just going to go around here with a pen marker so it's easier to see. And I'm just being very crude about this, in part because I'm not sure what type of map this is, whether or not I should really be using it, and in part because I've already drawn this out in a different way. Again, the level of detail here is going to depend on what you want. I think for the beginning, this is really meant to be a simple, easy thing. You don't need to be highly detailed about it, right? So this is our first layer, okay? So you just want to keep track of those. So this layer here, which is blue, right? That's our first layer. And then this one is our second layer. So this is that blue paper we chose originally. Then we've got a couple more colors that will go on top. And so I'm going to make 4 layers. So the next one, this ridge here, very obvious. This is clearly where the mountain starts and this is the low-lying land. So you want to make sure to include that because most people are going to recognize that. Now you might want to go real close, which is actually what I'm going to do here. Make it real close up. And you do not be afraid. You can certainly do this. Just go all the way to the edge. Happily to do that. That is one way that contour maps work. So you might just follow that edge along, and then maybe somewhere in here will come out a bit like that. Those are a bit contoury. Maybe there's one. This looks like some sort of low-lying coastal shelf bit. Throw a little bit in there. I can tell, there we go. I can tell already that this area is very low for most of it, but I don't want to go all the way back in the first layer because you want to give a little bit of depth to it, or the first layer on top. So it's really the third layer, I suppose. So we've done first layer, second layer. So this one is actually going to be our third layer. So I'll label that there. So I've got a few more to go. So maybe on this layer, I'll draw it all the way back to here. So we'll really get up to the ridges of the mountains. So I really want to keep that there, bring this up to here, give it a little bit of a squiggle, draw around there, right into there. Now let's come quite close here, that will look nice. There. Maybe we'll just go whoosh, and then do one of these. Let's trace those out a bit. There we go. I might draw these a little bit thinner, really, but this normally you should have a little bit more detail than what I'm doing, but it's fine when we get to cutting. So that'll be our fourth layer, essentially, right? First layer, second, third, fourth. So then we want to really pull up towards these top bits here. Really want them to give the sort of ragged suggestion of mountains. That's a valley. That's a valley. That's a little finger. Like that. Like that. Okay. Now, depending on how many colors you've chosen, you can go one higher than this, and maybe you're just sort of doing one of these where it's just a little, sort of like little octopus fingers going out there. Bam. Right, so that was 4. This one would have been 5. This one would have been 6 total. So that should correspond to every single layer that you bought paper for. And this is the first layer which you won't cut at all. And so then this one will be my brown layer. This one will be sort of lighter brown. This is one of the greens, second green, third green. I think I suggested actually 5 layers through my color scheme, but I've got more paper around. So I didn't show any tape at the beginning, but if you're using this method, you can use some tape. I'm sure you've got some around the house. And it doesn't really matter what kind of tape you're using, because in this case, it's just going on the top, and this is the layer you're going to cut. So long as you don't catch your paper underneath, just does not matter. So we'll take some of this masking tape. It'd be a little bit easier if we just put it on this piece of paper first. Line them up. Yep, that's good. Do one of these. So you can just go ahead and tape that paper down. Make sure, make sure it lays as flat as possible. You don't really want any bubbling when you're doing this. And this last one, pull that tape and then flatten that down. There we go. Now you should probably not do what I did here and make sure that you've taped over what you're going to cut. But in this case, again, not the most dramatic thing in the world, because you will just cut right through it. So what you want to do is start with the top layer. You want to cut from the inside out. So when you're doing that, you want to make sure when you're cutting from the inside out that the top layer is, in this case, the brown layer that I chose for the top of the mountains. So that's the color you want underneath, because you'll start in the center and cut each layer out successively. And this will help you, because then what you will have at the end are all of the layers matched up in the way that you wanted them to. And these sort of silhouettes that are left behind will help you position your map. So actually I'm going to choose a different knife because I work better with this knife. Now you can use, so I'm going to use this knife, which is my favorite kind. It's an NT cutter. But I imagine most people have around their house is one of these. Box cutter, craft knife, something like that. You can use a scalpel. You can do this with scissors. I find it's a little bit more difficult, but if that's what you're comfortable with, go for it. I suggest one of these, easily obtainable, quite cheap, and if the blade becomes dull, you just snap off the end and you've got more blades. So I'll just show you with this one first. So what you do is just start in the center, right? You want to press a little bit hard so you get through there. And when you're coming in, what you want to do is try and find where you started off your cut. And generally, if you can't see it, you can certainly feel it. You can just pull it across there. And then you try and set your blade in the edge where you started, and then pull like that. Now I have a whole course on how to cut out like this, but I'll just give you the highlights here, which is that because this is now fixed, what will actually be better is if you're able to turn your mat, because trying to turn your hand like this what happens is your blade starts to go like that, and that causes paper to tear and for things not to come out quite well. So it's actually much easier if you turn your mat or you turn your paper as you're cutting. So when I come to one of these, I'll do this, turn it, cut this way. You always want to cut towards you, and you want to make sure that as best as possible, you're holding your blade at a perpendicular angle to the paper and you're not tilting off to the side or like this. It causes the paper, it'll be fine, but it causes the paper to look a little bit different, which when you get up close you'll see, but you won't notice otherwise. So I started off there, right? So even if you have quite thick cards, you'll be able to do this. I do recommend, though, using nothing higher than maybe 150 GSM. When you're cutting, when you come up to an edge like this, you've got your knife blade there, you want to be careful about where you're going. You don't want to overcut too much where you slice in here, because particularly on this top layer, that will be very obvious. So be delicate with it. If you want to practice, you're really worried, maybe you bought some really nice paper, you're not sure about this, you can certainly go ahead and take my other class. There are all sorts of templates in there for you to try out practicing this. But you could practice on this one, as I'm doing now, on a blank one. And then when you've got this, you can just trace around it onto the paper directly when you're actually going to do it. And that will work out quite well for you. Now you can do what I did there, which is when you start to feel the paper tug and pull, you just press and hold from the direction that you're going away from. Particularly when you come back round to the first piece you've done. You might need to hold on to the paper. Right, so that's sort of the top layer I've drawn here. And then this is what you would do for every subsequent layer, is pull this back. You don't want to put it all the way off. Pull it back. We'll take this one out. You can see that I haven't quite gotten all of that where I want it to be. So you can go ahead and actually tidy that up. You can go ahead and tidy it up, not on top of this. Put it down there. Make sure that you particularly got the corners. That's usually where the paper sticks. Maybe I didn't press hard enough along here. So you just gently trace those lines out, and then all of this will pop free. There we go, like that. Right? So that's our top layer, which should normally be brown, but in this case of practice, it's white. And you want to make sure that you hold on to this and you don't flip it over. This is why having this bit at the end is very helpful, because when you're layering things, you can just put it back together like a jigsaw puzzle and know exactly where that should actually fit. And when you put the map down at the end, you can sort of fit each layer. It's like, oh no, it doesn't go that way. It doesn't really go that way. Ah, like that. You can fit each layer back in after you put a bit of glue on the back so that they sit in the position that you drew them. So then you want to go ahead and take another piece of paper, whatever your next color is again. Line that up and tape it back down, and then start again. This is the cut and trace method, which I think is perhaps the easiest for beginners to paper cutting. Lay out your drawing and then cut out each layer one by one. So you cut out one layer like this. And then you take your top layer, in this case I just got some scrap paper, you take your top layer, you position this on top where it should be in the center of the page. And then you trace out that layer you've just cut out. This way is a really good way as a beginner. There we go. On that corner, a really good way as a beginner to be able to get a little bit of practice, but then actually still have what you want to do. And you should only cut it out one layer at a time and then trace, because it gets increasingly harder as these become flexible. You know, it's just printer paper, to hold on to them and to trace them effectively. So it's easiest when they're like this in the negative space. So you trace this out onto your top layer, and then you can cut this out. It's much easier now to pay very close attention to where I'm cutting. One thing here, one here, drag that round. then it's much easier for me to essentially turn the paper and turn my knife as I cut. This is a very forgiving project, so if you mess up a little bit, the shape doesn't look right, doesn't matter, no one will know. The original drawing is really just a guideline. So you can do this, and you can always when you get to the end, if you just don't like the way the layers match up, you can always trim one back a bit to give a bit more depth. Right? So that's the other way to do this. So what I've done here is traced out every layer onto each one of my layers of paper. So there's my bottom layer, my first, second, third, and fourth layers. You can see that I've ensured the same size of all of my layers, and everything is positioned exactly as it was in my drawing, so that I will have these left over at the end when I'm done cutting the pieces out to help me lay them out. It's not essential that you watch the rest of this video. You can proceed on to the tracing and cutting if you would like to see that one. However, I've put this in so you can see how the layer gets cut out. Please note, I've speeded this up a little bit, so you should not actually be cutting this fast. We're going to draw out the contours of the map. So you can place your tracing paper down on top and then basically just take your pencil and start running around any obvious shapes you see. Now from this map, which is sort of a 3/4 elevation view, it's very obvious where mountains and plains are and where they sort of run up to the edge of the ocean. So you can sort of just trace around where they are. Now you need to make sure that when you draw out your contour lines, that what you're doing is keeping sure that you have just as many contour lines as you have pieces of paper. Remembering, of course, that the first piece of paper, in this case the blue one, goes on the bottom. It's very effective with these sorts of maps to make sure that every now and then some of your contour lines come up close to one another. It really gives a sense of depth or height, and so that can be really a powerful way to make it really pop. There are other ways to draw this, of course, and this way is simply using tracing paper, and then we'll flip it over and just scribble that onto the other paper to cut out. You could draw it on the computer. You could then print that out each layer by layer and then simply put your drawing on top of your layer of paper and cut through both at the same time. But I think it's easier to see how this works like this. Particularly in the beginning, a rough sketch is very, very important. So this gives me a sort of idea about where all of my layers are. And you can just drag along. There's no right or wrong in this. No one is ever going to come up to you and be like, oh no, I know that there's a ridge there. It doesn't happen. And so here I've just gone through and I'm just layering the different areas, so I made sure that there were the correct number, where one is my base layer. Just so I don't forget. So then when you pull it up, you have a good idea about of what the map might look like. And that's very reasonable, looks perfectly good, has a bunch of different shapes in it. This version is quite smooth and circular. You can use a lot more hard angles. You'll see in my final piece that I have a bit more angles and sort of corners, but whatever sort of shape you get that works for you is great. Now you can just do what I'm doing here. You can just immediately start taking this and tracing it out onto your paper. This is not really the best way to use tracing paper, but again, this is just sort of a draft, and I can go over those lines that I'm pressing into the paper when I'm done with this. You can use any method that you want, but I want you to bear in mind that when you're done, what you need is one copy of reference, essentially, so that you can look at what you've drawn and know how to position the layers. And then you need one of each layer on each individual piece of paper. So if you want to use a glass dish or a window as a light board to trace things, go for it. If you have an actual tracing pad, that's great. Make sure to look at your other maps, like this one here, adjust what you're doing. You can take as much or as little time drawing out the contours as you want. Now, one fun other bit you can do with maps like this is to put text that names the location in it. So what I did here was wrote the name Kauai, and you can see that it's both backwards and vertical. And I went onto the computer, found a font that I liked, typed it out, and then I traced it onto the back using one of the methods that I showed you before. Now I've left this up on the screen so that you can see that this is really backwards, and in this case it's also upside down. So I would flip this from the bottom up, and then it would read correctly from the top down, Kauai. It's very important that when you lay this out on your paper that you're drawing it on the back and that the text is backwards. So when you're cutting it, you're cutting from the back to the front because you want to look at the side that you didn't draw on. So just pay attention to that when you're laying out your text. Welcome to the gluing section of the tutorial. We are almost done. So there are two ways to do gluing depending on which type of glue you bought. If you bought the 3M spray repositionable glue as I suggested, then this is very simple. You simply need to lay your pieces of card down, face down, on a piece of spare cardboard or somewhere outside, or even if you have to hold them between your fingers, I suppose. Now if you're using the stick or Uhu glue, you're simply going to want to spread this very, very, very thinly, as thin as you possibly can, on, I usually use some type of spreader, so in this case a spare piece of paper like so. And you want to get that just as thin as possible, and then very gently rub that along the back edge of your pieces. Again, helpfully done on a piece of cardboard like this. You want to gently spread that thin layer along the back as close to the edges as possible, but also ensuring that you get enough in the center so that it sticks. You can see I already pasted down my first layer here. Essentially, I just chose where it should sit and pasted it down. Now, depending on how tight you drew the layers, it will be essential to refer back to either a photograph of your drawing itself, or the offcuts you made when you were cutting it out of the paper to know exactly how to position those layers. I've drawn my layers exceptionally tight with very specific curves where they almost overlap. So it's very important here. What I'm doing is looking back at my photograph. Now with the glue, particularly the repositionable adhesive, you have a little bit of time to sort of play around and make sure it works. They will never be as precise in the cutting and laying out as you imagined if you drew them quite tight as I did. So there will be a little bit of negotiation here where I figure out where it goes and then lay it down. You can always come back later, particularly even when it's glued like this, and make a tiny cut to remove any layer that ends up being beyond where you intend it to be. Now, if when you cut out your layers, you held on to the piece from which you cut it, like this, you can lay it back on top as a guide to put your piece exactly where you had intended it. This will be a rough approximation of where you drew it. So I've got the glue on the back, I just slot that in. You just have to make sure that the paper is facing the right way up so that the top side is in fact face up. And then you can just sort of go around, make sure to pull it back out. It's sort of like a little puzzle piece, but you can use that as a guide. I'm laying this last layer down freehand, and I'll show you how to adjust something if you don't like its ultimate positioning. So I have these tiny pieces meant to represent the very top of the mountains, and you can sort of see at the top how that light green layer underneath is peeking out, and I don't really want that in my final design. I hadn't thought about it that way. So I've put it down for the moment to find the other pieces, figure out where they go, and look at the overall effect before I go back and trim that. You can either first go back and try and cut away the layer, or you can reposition it and then cut away the part at the top. So what I'm doing is pulling this first piece up and then gently just getting that layer below it to release a bit so I can reposition it slightly. I've decided that that's actually where the problem is. So once I've got that up, even though the glue is still a little bit wet, this is still possible, I can pull it up without damaging it and then just shift it slightly to the left. Particularly when you have a long cut, as I did there to follow the ridge of a mountain, you can pull the piece over and it's very easy. So I've repositioned that better in line with the layer below it, and then I'll put this piece back on about where I thought I wanted it in the first place, and that looks much better. The brown, however, this top layer, pokes out a bit over, and I can tell when you're up close that it doesn't match up evenly. So I'm just going back with my knife and very carefully trimming off that little spike on the edge. And now I can go back and put my last bit of my top layer in position. Lay it down. Make sure it looks good. And press it out. There we go. Thank you very much for joining me, and I can't wait to see some of your topographic map creations.